Chapter 12. Shauna didn't have a watch, a phone, or anything to tell time. The conference room didn't have a clock on the wall. It didn't even have a window. At least when they'd been trapped on the lifeboat, the sun and moon still rose and set. Time passed, and the lapping waves rocking the boat had been the only things that had kept her sane while Catfish slumbered in his ill exhaustion. She had promised herself she would get a watch. Too late now. After the scientists, Sarah, and Givens piled into their chairs with fresh provisions, an awkward silence filled the room. Less than a minute later, Moore entered and returned to her seat at the table. "I hope everyone had a good break," she said. "Find everything okay?" A few nods and whispers responded. Moore's fake smile faltered. "Does anyone have any questions for Shauna or Mr.?" She stopped herself before glancing at Catfish with a shark's grin. "Or questions for Catfish?" No one said a word. Moore nodded to herself. "Okay then, let's move on. The M2 test barrel ended up at HAL. Kate?" Kate looked more than a little nervous. She gathered herself for a moment and then began to speak. She told them about the barrel's arrival, Krieger becoming infected, and the first round of tests they'd run on the sample. HAL's initial tests of the oil had confirmed Shauna's analysis. The substance was the sweetest crude ever recovered, despite its color. Additional analyses provided similar information until they got to the tests that included light. The substance seemed to absorb all spectrums of light except bright white. That had made the sample simply explode with a pop, and it scared the hell out of everyone. Kate said it was then that they knew something was very wrong. "Finally, M2 got loose in the lab. It started as a puddle," Kate said, "but eventually consumed enough material to grow, and it grew damned fast." Shauna saw motion out of the corner of her eye. Givens and Sarah were nodding to one another. More commonalities. Shauna had seen the same thing in the lab on Liger when one of the samples nearly consumed her. If not for Thomas's quick thinking, she would have perished inside the sealed lab. The thought made her eyes moist. Thomas had saved them again and again, but in the end, she hadn't been able to save him. "After that," Kate said, "it ate or destroyed sheetrock, carpet, people, anything biological. Jay, my daughter, and I ended up in the basement of the new building. M2 followed us through the HVAC. Jay created a makeshift battery bomb, and we killed the damn thing." "Battery bomb?" Catfish asked, his eyes focused on Jay. The older scientist grinned. "Yeah, short the leads, and the battery heats the wire to a high temperature, especially once you cut away the insulation." "How'd you make that?" Catfish asked. Jay held up his gloved hand. "Not very well. Had to use some cloth to hold things together. It, caught fire." "Christ," Catfish said. "But it worked?" "It did," Jay said. "Exploded the thing like it was a firecracker." "Anything left of it?" Shauna asked. Kate shook her head. "No, Dr. Moore's team combed the facility looking for other signs of the creatures, but found nothing." "At least there's that," Catfish said. Moore cleared her throat. "Any other details you want to add, Kate?" The chemist slowly shook her head. Shauna thought for a moment that Kate would say something else, but she didn't. She scribbled a note on her pad. Perhaps Kate would be more forthcoming once they were down in the lab. Moore looked around the room, purposely making eye contact with everyone. Damn, but she was intimidating. Shauna could feel the tension coming off Catfish in waves and knew he'd like nothing more than to punch Moore in the mouth. Shauna understood the rage boiling beneath his skin. Catfish wanted answers, and Moore wanted to play games and try to cow them all instead. Shauna nearly chuckled aloud. Moore didn't seem to understand that Catfish was immune to those tactics. When he finally made that clear, Shauna wondered how Moore would respond. "Any questions for Kate or the other HAL survivors?" Moore asked. Survivors. The word echoed in Shauna's mind as though shouted at the mountains from a valley floor. They should get t-shirts. "I survived M2 and all I got was this lousy t-shirt." It would be a perfect addition to this clusterfuck. No one said a word. "Thank you, Kate," Moore said. "Let's take a 5-minute break and then cover the last third of this meeting." The head of the facility drank from her cup while swiping at the tablet before her. Catfish sighed. "Might as well get my heart racing again," he said. "You want another over-caffeinated energy drink that's driving you one step closer to a heart attack?" Shauna asked. "Yes, please. Extra heart attack on the side." She rolled her eyes and stepped away from the table. A shadow fell across her as she reached the ice bucket of cans. She quickly turned and nearly ran into Kate. The woman stepped back in surprise. "I'm sorry, Shauna," Kate said. Shauna managed to tap down the brief rush of adrenaline. "No problem," Shauna said. "A little jumpy." Kate made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Aren't we all?" Shauna nodded, her shaking hands pulling the energy drink from the bucket. "Have you been down to the labs?" Kate smiled. "Of course. I helped design 2 of the retrofits. Well, with Neil's help, of course." "The biochemist?" "Right," she said. "We spent some time brainstorming about what we'd need, and Moore gave us the means to put it together." "Makes sense, I guess," Shauna said. "Look," Kate said, "I can't promise nothing bad will happen. Shit, who can? But I know we've taken every precaution we know to. If there's any suggestion you want to make, I'll be more than happy to hear it and take you up on it. It's not like I have a budget." "Seriously?" Kate's grin widened. "I don't know what kind of paycheck you're getting, but I can't imagine it's small." "It's not," Shauna said. "Let's just say, then, that this is a well-funded project. I don't want to know how or by whom, but if we need something, we get it." Shauna nodded. It was almost like working for Thomas again. If they had a new idea, something that would require some bootstrapping, he found the money. He always did. "Always had," she corrected herself. "Had." "You okay?" Kate asked. "Yeah," Shauna said, wiping at one eye. "I'm fine, just tired. These meetings," she said apologetically, "aren't easy." "No," Kate agreed, "they're not." "Ladies, gentlemen," Moore called, "can we get started?" Sarah's account of the Ben Toab incident took less than 10 minutes. An infected scientist had been brought into the emergency quarantine area at Ben Toab Hospital, the CDC took over, and something had happened. Something bad. Sarah, it turned out, worked for HPD SWAT, or had. Same with Givens. They hadn't known what they would be fighting and were completely unprepared for what happened. Dr. Krieger, the scientist from HAL, had been eaten by the creature from the inside out, replacing her body with a large pool of oil, which quickly decimated the CDC team. By the time SWAT arrived, the creature had already taken several lives and destroyed much of the ER wing. Then it escaped containment. Sans communication with the outside world, her SWAT team found themselves trapped inside Ben Toab with the creatures. Without Dr. Moore's assistance over the radio, all of Ben Toab would have been destroyed, and everyone lost. Shauna scribbled on the pad. She reoriented the pen in her fingers and delicately flipped it from one end to the other. The words "M on radio, did she already know?" stared back at her in black ink. Sarah spoke about how the creatures had changed, their exteriors hardening once they reached a certain size, how their talons clicked on the tiled floors, and how they moved. She and her team had acquired several infant blankets made for jaundice and used the high-intensity UV rays to corral one of the creatures. But before they could destroy it, a larger creature had burst through the walls and devoured its smaller brethren. Once again, Shauna was struck by that fact. Somehow it was important, although she couldn't say why. She wrote it down, her scribbles practically indecipherable, even to herself. By the time Sarah finished, Shauna had pretty much stopped listening. The ending of Sarah's story had been more or less the same as HAL's, although the creature the SWAT team had destroyed was monstrous. Not as large as she imagined Liger's M2 had been, but still a massive creature. Liger's large M2 creature hadn't moved like that. It hadn't taken a well-defined shape. It sprouted tentacles, horrid maws, and eye stalks, but it had never had a distinct body. Both the HAL and Ben Toab creatures had somehow managed to transform themselves. The carapace, insectile crustaceous features, working mandibles, all those details had been missing from the M2 hostiles that destroyed Liger. But the Ben Toab tale was even more worrisome than the HAL encounter. For one thing, the creatures moved both intelligently and purposefully. They sought out food like hunters, not slime molds. They had also managed to take out light sources and other obstacles. M2 had evolved, or maybe differentiated was the correct word. Either way, the creature had changed radically between the 3 encounters. Shauna wrote the word evolution in messy block letters. It stared back at her like an accusation. She added a question mark to it. The word caused another shiver, but she couldn't say why. By the time Sarah and Givens had finished telling their story, Kefish felt exhausted. They hadn't been in that room for more than a few hours, which included several breaks, but it seemed much longer, like days. He had a feeling that it was only going to get worse. He was both right and wrong. After they ate lunch in the conference room, catered by Chef Robbie, of course, Moore put on a slideshow of sorts. It mainly included reiterating the facility rules of conduct, security, use of the commissary, and the custodial schedules. Moore made it clear they weren't responsible for cleaning their domiciles, nor washing their clothes. All that was handled for them. Catfish wanted to ask Moore if that meant he could throw a kegger in his trailer, but decided it wasn't worth it. Getting the "someone just shitting in my coffee" look from Moore would have brought him great joy, but it would have made the meeting last longer, and that was the last goddamn thing he wanted. Besides, Shauna looked as antsy as he felt. She wanted out of here too. A glance around the table told Catfish everyone felt that way. Well, everyone but Givens. That man didn't seem to react to anything. When Moore finished repeating all the rules, boring them stupid with cautions about security infractions and the armed sentries walking the perimeter at night, he'd nearly chuckled. All that to impress them? Or scare them? Bullshit. He'd noticed the mounted cameras on the fences and those on the surrounding buildings. Moore had this place on lockdown. Cameras everywhere, probably infrared capable. Even the idea of armed sentries was a joke. No one was getting in here that hadn't already been cleared. It was probably even worse in the building where the HAL folks stayed. They wouldn't even have to attempt to hide them there. Every centimeter of those buildings was watched. He was sure of it. Which begged another question. Were the sentries, cameras, and constant cautions aimed at keeping someone else out, or the scientists in? While Moore would no doubt suffer an embolism if any of her prized eggheads escaped the compound, an interloper gaining access to the facility would make her vaporize it with a nuclear blast. He knew what was beneath that woman's mask. And who would want to get in here? Good question. Who could possibly know anything about what happened to HAL or Ben Toab, much less Leaguer? Catfish smirked as Moore finished up her list of informational drivel. Moore might be able to cover up the HAL incident completely, but Ben Toab? Between the high number of casualties and the number of patients and staff that survived, keeping a lid on that little train wreck would be much more difficult. Was the NSA going to follow the survivors around for the rest of their lives? Monitor their internet usage? Who they talked to? What they wrote down? What they said? Anything indicating treachery or rumor-mongering? He doubted it. Well, the internet part, all too easy, but the rest? No goddamn way. With the lunch debris cleared and fresh cups of coffee and iced cans of sodas distributed, Moore brought up 3 new slides. Each contained a map of the facility lying beneath them. 4 levels. 1 level for engineering, 1 for labs, and another for quarantine. She didn't mention the 4th. When she said the Q word, Catfish sat up in his chair, the meeting daze and glaze gone from his eyes. Quarantine? He asked. Moore didn't bother meeting his stare. Quarantine is the most secure of the levels, she said. It's where any samples are flushed. Also, it's where anyone having had physical contact with M2 will be kept for observation. Observation, he thought. Great word. You kept the subject for observation to see how the disease manifests, and how the creature might consume you from the inside out, until you were little more than a pool of living black. The image of an eye stalk rising out of the darkness filled his mind. Catfish shook away the mental movie trying to play through his skull. We will walk you through each emergency system when we have the tour later, she said. Tour? Shauna asked. Moore's fake smile returned, thinner and more forced than ever. Yes, a tour. Wait, Catfish said. You said 4 levels. He pointed at the slide on the screen. What's the 4th level? Moore's smile completely disappeared. Maintenance, she said. Facility, emergency power, bilge, etc. Nothing you need to worry about. Wait, Catfish said. Bilge? Moore's gaze turned to him with slight disinterest. You do know how shallow the water table is here? I have an idea. Catfish scratched at his beard. What does that have to... Catfish gritted his teeth as he realized what she meant. You mean in case the lower levels flood? That is correct, Moore said. Although we have updated as much as we can, the facility has been here a long time, and the movement of the aquifer has caused some leaks here and there. So you can burn us to death or we could drown, Catfish said. Are those my only options? Besides getting eaten, Jay said. With a hiss of exasperation, Kate said, "People, focus. Memorize the layout. I want to ensure everyone knows what to do if something happens." She cleared her throat and swallowed hard. "We all need to remember that the facility's security itself is a far second in priorities." "First priority being?" Jay asked. Kate pointed vaguely at the conference room wall. "That out there, above us and less than a kilometer or two away, human beings live in their houses. Their children play and attend school." She shifted her finger and tapped it hard on the table. "If we don't do our jobs, if we aren't vigilant, M2 will wipe them out, and then the rest of the city." The room went cold with a crushing silence. Damn, but Kate looked furious at the idea. Not wistful or nervous. Her eyes burned with something personal. Her daughter, perhaps? Yeah, Catfish thought to himself. Only a mother could look like that, one whose child had been threatened. Or killed. "Any questions?" Moore asked finally. Chapter 13. When Moore had finished the rest of her presentation, she ushered them to the elevator, and they began their descent. The elevator display changed from transit to ENG. The car came to a gentle stop, and the door dinged cheerily. "First, stop." Moore glanced at Catfish. "Kate will show you around." "Wait," Shauna said. "What if I want to see?" The director said icily, "Then you can do so on your own time." Catfish once again found himself wanting to hit Moore. He'd never met anyone so capable of condescension without raising their voice or needing sarcasm to do it. The clipped, precise words and perfect diction, accompanied by the ever-present automaton-like grin, combined to form the most asshole of a human being he could have imagined. He opened his mouth to pelt her with obscenities, but Shauna touched his shoulder. "Let it go," she whispered. Forcing his fingers to unclench from fists, fingernail marks buried in the flesh of his palm, he smiled at her and stepped across the threshold into an unmarked, brightly lit white corridor. The faint memory of fresh paint underlay the normally antiseptic smell that recycled air usually had. The elevator dinged, and he glanced backward and waved to Shauna. She returned it as the car doors slid shut and the lift continued downward. Kate was looking at him. "What?" "Nothing," she said with a smile. Shaking his head, Catfish looked down the hall, which ended in a large metal door. A guard armed with an incinerator stood beside it, his dungarees unmarked by insignias, rank, or hardware. A pair of dark goggles peeked out from beneath a hood, fabric covering nearly every piece of skin, protecting as if from a harsh desert sun. The soldier, guard, or whatever the hell he was, nodded to Kate as they made their way down the hall. The bright lights and the white-painted floor, walls, and ceiling combined to hurt his eyes. He needed sunglasses. "Bright enough in here?" Catfish said. His squeaking crutches was the only sound apart from the soft pad of her athletic shoes on the thick steel floor. "The halls have the new bulbs installed. They pump out the same UV spectrum as sunlight. However," she said, "we're beginning to find out just how reliable they aren't." He glanced at her, his face screwed up in a frown. What the hell does that mean? They had reached the large steel door, which might have been torn from a bank vault. Probably had been. Kate waved her bracelet at the sensor, and the door slid aside, revealing an airlock. "Really?" Kate laughed. "Did you forget this was designed to hold in ETs?" "Not on the engineering level." "No," she agreed. "Security precaution in case pollutants get into the air recycling system." He nodded toward the corridor behind them. "That's on a different system." "They all are," Kate said. "But there are air shafts connecting the levels. Guessing the architects of this monstrosity weren't too worried about anything getting up here. We had to retrofit this area extensively, and we're still having some power problems." "Great," he said. "So how the hell do you know they're going to work when they need to?" She took in a shuddering breath as they walked through the airlock. "I don't." A chill crawled down his spine. "Well," Kate said, gesturing to the large space. "What do you think?" The rectangular floor had a single recessed area marked Printing, enclosed in what looked like soundproof walls. Tools, sheet metal, shelves and shelves of printer material, and a steel wall with a hatch marked Testing filled out the room. "Looks like someone shit out a high-end home despot." She laughed. "Fairly accurate. The testing area is both explosion and fireproof. Just, don't make anything too big." "Is that a challenge?" Catfish asked with a grin. "No, it certainly isn't." She led him past the security console where no one stood and to the construction area. The curtained-off portion had plenty of space for welding, cutting, and other loud and potentially dirty jobs. "Console is over there," she said, pointing toward a large desk curled in a rough L shape. Multiple monitors hung above it, their screens blank. You should be able to send blueprints and anything else you need from here. Now all you need is a bracelet. He frowned. Bracelet? With a smile, she took him to the security desk. Givens appeared from nowhere, his face set in a stony line, eyes dead and uninterested. Catfish placed his hand on a device, and after it scanned his fingerprints, it spat out a printed bracelet with a chip. He stared at it before slapping it around his wrist. That should be that, Kate said, leading him to the consoles. He noticed Givens was following them, the holsters on his hips making him look like a strangely garbed gunslinger. When they reached the console, she showed him how to log in using the bracelet. Once he did, the console screens came to life and a black command prompt stared at him from the desktop. He said, scratching his head. This looks like my desktop at home. Interesting, Kate said with a knowing smile. I never would have guessed that. He listed the files in the directory and stared at the screen. It was his home directory. From the computer at his home. He fucking mirrored my computer. His voice had become the snarl of a rabid animal brimming with deep fury. It made Kate step away from him. Givens stepped forward. Catfish glared at the shorter man. Going to do something? Only if I have to. Just remember, Givens said and gestured to Kate. She didn't do it. The words tamped down the fire, a little. He wanted to hit something, smash it, torture it, destroy it. What made it worse was that he knew who did it, and the bitch wasn't here right now. That's who he wanted to threaten, scream at, and punch with as much power as he could muster. Givens was right. My apologies, he said to Kate through clenched teeth, and forced himself to relax his hands. The hateful glare took more effort. He turned back to the screen and checked the drive assignments. His old drives were there, mounted and ready for him. Every drive, every directory, every file. Moore had copied everything. Might as well have just lifted the drives out and put them in here, except for one difference. These mirrored drives had been decrypted. How? Shaking his head, he looked at the drive assignments again and noticed 3 that didn't belong. One was marked M2 Surveillance Archives, another marked M2 Device Research, and the last was marked M2 Entity Research. He quickly checked the folders to determine how many files were in each. The Archives folder held over 500 terabytes of data. The other 2? Practically empty. Skeleton directories, a few README files, and not much else. However, the device directory had one interesting subfolder, AUV5. He feverishly typed in commands, finding telemetry records and data dumps. How? Kate cleared her throat. I take it this means you're ready for work. He turned to her, his face a mask of confusion. What are those? She followed his finger and leaned forward to look at the file names. I'm not sure. I think you'll have to ask more. Tell me, he said to her. Exactly what the hell am I supposed to do here? Givens took another step forward until he was practically at Catfish's elbow. You and I are going to make some weapons, he said coldly. Something useful. Really? And what engineering expertise are you bringing to this endeavor? The word engineering dripped with sarcasm. Givens's eyes finally came to life. I fought the things and won. You, he said with a sniff, ran. The room went silent as Catfish's mouth opened in surprise. Even Kate seemed taken aback. When Catfish finally managed to find his voice, indignant rage colored every word. We had no weapons, asshole. Givens grinned. We did. We made them. Big deal. I blew up the mother of this shit. And that's the only reason you don't have a bullet in your brain, Givens said. So maybe we should get to it instead of me having to listen to your hurt ego. Catfish swung a fist without even knowing he was going to do it. The blow, awkwardly aimed and difficult to throw with a crutch under his arm, did more than miss. The crutch fell from beneath his arm as his skin flew less than a centimeter from Givens's pallid face. Givens's arm snaked out in a blur, catching Catfish's wrist and turning it while his other hand shot around Catfish's chest. Bad mistake, Givens said. He twisted the wrist and Catfish cried out in pain. But not a bad throw for a cripple. Then Catfish realized something. He should have fallen to the ground in a heap. Instead, Givens's arm around his waist held him up and kept him from smashing into the thick steel door. Catfish said nothing as he limped sideways, leaning on his remaining crutch to stabilize himself, while he shrugged away from Givens's embrace. The soldier with the dead eyes let him go, but held his hands out as if to catch him if he fell. Catfish looked into the man's eyes again and saw a hint of amusement. For once, the asshole didn't seem so robotic. "If you two are done marking your territory," Kate said, "I need to visit the lab level." She nodded to Catfish. "You'll find email addresses in a shared doc on your computer. Send me one if you have questions or need some support, although Givens here should be able to help you with anything you need." Without breaking his stare with Givens, he smiled and said, "I'm sure we'll get along great, right?" Givens smiled. It was somehow more terrifying than his usual expressionless stare. "We sure will." "Great," Kate said and clapped her hands together. "Then I'll leave you to it." She turned and walked away without looking back at them. Catfish watched her retreat through the blast door and into the corridor. "Well," he said at last, "are we done pissing?" "For now," Givens said. "Just let me know if you want to go again, but," he said, pointing at Catfish's cast, "I think we need to wait until you're all healed up." Catfish chuckled. "Maybe." He turned to look at the computer. "All right, Mr. Givens." "Just Givens," he said. "And I'm just Catfish. So, what do you want to make first?" Givens grinned like a starved shark. "Something that goes boom." Catfish sat in his trailer, his fingers clenching and unclenching as he stared at the gray sky. The night was coming fast, and he couldn't wait for it to arrive. Meetings, meetings, meetings. All he wanted was a pack of cigarettes, a cold beer, a bowl of Cindy White, and some chicken wings. Was that too much to ask? At the end of the day, he and Shauna presented more with a list of necessities. Catfish had included 3 different models of nicotine vaporizers, a list of brands and flavors, and an order for 3 cartons of the darkest, foulest, cheapest brand of cigarettes he could think of. That, an economy pack of plastic lighters, and a strong halogen flashlight. Shauna's list had included a steel flip-top lighter and a request for several halogen flashlights. She hadn't been very specific. Catfish wasn't surprised by the request for lights, but the fact she wanted a Zippo had been confusing until he remembered Jay and his battery bomb. Moore had looked at the list and nodded at the remarks about needing real clothes, jackets, and footwear. As Moore said, it was all doable. She'd seen something on the list that drew her attention. Her voice dropped off in volume and stopped altogether. When she finally looked up from the paper, her cold, fake smile had returned. Her eyes, however, said something else entirely. Catfish thought one of their requests had surprised her or given her an idea. Probably both. Catfish continued staring into the growing darkness. The sky pissed on the ground again, the droplets spattering against the trailer's roof, ceasing nearly as quickly as they had begun. He opened the trailer's screen door and stepped out. The distant lights of the airfield glowed like halos in the misty air. He took a sip from the soda and let out a long belch. His stomach responded with a hungry gurgle. Dinner couldn't be far away. Hopefully Moore would have some gifts for him and Shauna. Catfish rubbed at his itchy dungarees. What he wouldn't give for a Skinny Puppy t-shirt and an internet radio thrashing out metal and industrial tunes at top volume loud enough to make the dishes tremble inside the cupboards. Well, he thought, that's one way to get around the audio surveillance. Of course, that would require him and Shauna to hear one another during such a sonic assault. No, that won't work. Next. He'd have to think of something else. Think. That was a joke. He flinched when he saw motion at the edge of the door, memories of the day evaporating into the present. Shauna stood in the gathering darkness, her fatigue jacket covering the donated sweater. "You ready for dinner?" He smiled. "Yeah," he said. "Then you can tell me about the rest of your day since I wasn't invited to the lab." A brief shadow of concern crossed her face but quickly evaporated. Now he was more than a little curious about how her day had gone. That look didn't exactly reassure him. She grinned. "I have a feeling something will be waiting for us when we get back to the commissary." "Like what?" Catfish asked. "Provisions,"